So I want to talk to you guys about how to read short fiction. So one of the things that you need to keep in mind as you are reading a short piece of fiction, as opposed to, let's say, a novel, is that short fiction can be difficult to understand sometimes because it is compressed. So if you think about a novelist having hundreds and hundreds of pages sometimes to communicate a message, an author writing a short story is going to have far fewer pages to do that. So maybe 10, in some cases, maybe just 2. And so everything matters in the short story. So in order to grasp the full meaning and to really get the depth of what the writer is saying, you're going to need to read the text more than one time. And this isn't something that we all like to do, right? We want to read it and move on. Now, that initial reading can be for pleasure, and it should be. You should always read a short story for pleasure the first time. And then as you go back through subsequent readings, I want you to pay attention to some of these elements. One of my tips that I like to give students is a lot of the time, the writer of the short story is going to tell the reader some of his or her main themes or the main focus of the work in the first few paragraphs of the story, and in the title as well. So just by looking at those very first few paragraphs and at the title, you're going to get a pretty good understanding the majority of the time of some of the main themes or ideas in the short story. So some of these elements that I want you to be aware of, we'll talk about these now. And the first is structure. So the action of the story is called the plot. So this is just what happens. So if I say, tell me what the story is about, I'm asking you for plot. And plot is driven by some sort of conflict, okay? If there is no conflict, there is no story. And the conflict can be internal or external. So the conflict can take place within a character. So a character could be in conflict with herself. Or the conflict could be external, meaning that the character is in conflict with another character, or the character can even be in conflict with his culture or society. So, and there may be more than one conflict. But look for the conflict in every storyline. Conflict will build as the story unfolds to what's called a climax. Sometimes there is resolution of the conflict, and sometimes it just ends and there is no resolution. So if you're a person who always likes a story with a happy ending, you might not always get that. Sometimes the conflict is resolved in positive ways. Sometimes it's resolved in tragic ways. Sometimes it's not resolved at all. Most often, stories are told chronologically. First something happens, then the next thing, then the next thing. But oftentimes, an author might use a flashback, stops the forward movement of the story to recall something that happened in the past. And this is often done to provide perhaps necessary background information that the reader might need to make sense of the story, or just to create suspense. So pay attention to the structure of the story. How is it told? Is it told chronologically? Are there flashbacks where you go back in time? Do we have circular patterns where things seem to get repeated? All of those are issues of structure that you need to pay attention to. All right, let's see. Point of view is the next element here. And this is just the position from which the author tells the story. So an omniscient narrator is a narrator that knows everything and provides insight into the thoughts and feelings of the characters. So an omniscient narrator is going to know what all the characters think and feel. First-person narrators are actually characters in the story, okay? And authors carefully choose those narrators, okay? So I want you to think when you read, why did a particular author choose to tell this story from this perspective? And how would the story be different if a different character told the story, or if it was told from a different point of view? All right, let's see. Next is setting. The setting of a story involves time, place, and atmosphere. So the time the story was written, or the time period it focuses on, this is super important because stories spring out of their cultural spaces, and they also help define their cultural spaces. So a story that you tell, let's say in 1920, would have a very different feel and context than, let's say, a story told in 2021. Okay, so the time matters, the setting matters. And as we talk about the stories for this class, we are going to be talking a lot about cultural context. What is happening during the time period that that particular story was written? What does the culture look like? What do we learn about the values of that time period? What do we learn about the prejudices of that time period? Those are going to be things we're definitely interested in. So the time matters, the place matters. Where does the story take place? And could the story have taken place somewhere else, right? Or does the setting, the place of the story matter, and why? And then the third element of setting is atmosphere. What does it feel like? Is it a gloomy situation? Is it an intense or stressful situation? What is the atmosphere that the story that surrounds the events or the plot of the story? Character, obviously this is important. And physical traits, what a character looks like, actions, what a character does, words, what a character says, and how others feel about a character are all elements of characterization. So just think about the way you know people in your life. You know them by how they look, what they do, what they say, and what other people say or feel about them. The same is true for a character in fiction. The main character of a story is called the protagonist. The antagonist of a story is going to work against the main character. As you read any short story, look for special techniques a writer might use to create meaning. So an upsetting of expectations, for example, is irony. So what happens is when you feel like a story is going to play out a certain way, and then there's a surprise at the end, for example, that is irony. And why might a writer do that? Okay. Hints of future happenings are called foreshadowings. So you might get hints early on in a story that something is going to occur. Okay, pay attention to that. Words and phrases that put a picture in your mind are called images. And if repeated often enough, those images can take on a special meaning and become symbols. So pay attention to the symbols in the stories. objects that actually represent something beyond themselves. So in addition to these literary elements, you should also pay attention to titles. Titles of a short story tell. They prepare you for what is to come. And it's even important to investigate the author's life and the author's culture, because the time period of a literary work is always going to affect its meaning. Literature is a cultural artifact. So in order to understand culture, you've got to read its literature. And in order to understand a work of literature, you have to understand its culture. So as you read these short stories in this class, I want you to keep these elements in mind. And don't, yes, read for pleasure, but also read to try to figure out what messages, what ideas is the writer trying to communicate through his or her work.